He killed 2 federal agents in minutes. Then, he died in a stolen government car. America called him Babyface. On November 27, 1934, outside Binghamton, Illinois, Lester Gillis turned a highway chase into one of the bloodiest encounters of the Depression-era crime war. He was 25 years old. He stood exactly 5'4", and after the gunfire finally stopped, 2 federal agents were dying. Gillis was critically wounded, and the man the world knew as Babyface Nelson was rapidly running out of road. If you know the movie Public Enemies, you know the face. Small, young-looking, unstable, a man holding a machine gun and projecting absolutely no visible fear. Hollywood gave you the image, but the real history gives you something far worse. Lester Gillis wasn't just John Dillinger's reckless sidekick. He was a prison escapee, a veteran car thief, a bootlegging gunman, and, ultimately, the killer of 3 federal agents. Even inside a criminal underworld built entirely on violence, Nelson held a reputation for being too volatile, too reckless, and far too dangerous to control. This is the real story of Babyface Nelson, the Chicago kid who learned early that violence could open doors, the fugitive who joined America's most famous bank robbers, and the man who discovered that every single escape route eventually becomes a dead end. The question isn't whether he was violent. The historical record is brutally clear on that. The question is why the smallest man in the gang became the one everybody feared. To understand that, you have to go back to the beginning. Lester Gillis was born in Chicago on December 6, 1908. He grew up in a city built on factories, railroads, stockyards, politics, vice, and golden opportunity. Chicago could make a working man rich, but it could also teach a young boy that stealing a car paid a lot faster than sweating in a shop. By his early teens, Gillis was already moving with juvenile street gangs. At 14 years old, he was an accomplished car thief. His appearance handed him the nickname that would define his life, Babyface. He looked significantly younger than his age. He had round features and a boyish expression, the kind of innocent face that made adults instinctively underestimate him. That was the first real advantage he ever had. In Chicago's criminal world, a stolen car was more than just transportation. It was a job. It was a getaway plan. It was a mechanical ghost. It was a way to move liquor, weapons, stolen property, or people across the vast city without asking permission from anyone. Gillis learned the street-level mathematics early on. He knew which streets had active police patrols, which underground garages would ask the fewest questions, exactly how long it took for the police to respond to a call, and how quickly an ordinary, unremarkable vehicle could transform into damning evidence. The boy with the harmless face was learning the mechanics of a ghost. In 1922, he was convicted of auto theft and committed to a boys' home. 2 years later, he was paroled. But the freedom didn't last. Within 5 short months, he was right back in trouble on another remarkably similar charge. That pattern matters. Prison didn't reform Lester Gillis. It simply taught him the cold rhythm of the justice system: arrest, confinement, release, return. Over the next few years, Gillis moved seamlessly through the booming criminal economy created by prohibition. He stole tires, he ran illegal stills, he participated in high-stakes bootlegging, he committed armed robberies. Every single racket required a completely different, specialized skill set. Bootlegging meant mastering routes, managing drivers, securing storage space, and buying protection. Robbery meant pure nerve, precise timing, heavy weapons, and absolute silence. The opportunity in front of him was glaringly obvious. Prohibition had made alcohol illegal, but it certainly hadn't made the American public stop drinking. That massive contradiction created an enormous, cash-rich market. The inside connections were the local drivers, the garage owners, the liquor runners, and the seasoned criminals who knew exactly how to move illicit goods through the bustling streets of Chicago. The execution of these crimes depended heavily on speed and raw intimidation. The money always came in untraceable cash, but the problem remained eternally the same. Every job produced witnesses, every witness produced descriptions, and every description made the young man with the harmless, boyish face a little easier to find. In 1928, Gillis married Helen Wozniak, an ordinary salesgirl. She became Helen Gillis, and faithfully kept that name throughout their marriage. That's one of the quiet details that deeply complicates every clean Hollywood gangster legend. Nelson had a wife. He had a real home life. He had someone who knew him intimately, before the blazing newspapers officially turned him into a public enemy. But having a wife waiting at home doesn't soften the brutal facts of who he was. It only sharpens the contradiction. By January 1931, Gillis had crossed the invisible line into major, inescapable trouble. He was formally convicted of a Chicago bank robbery and handed a devastating sentence, 1 year to life. The state sent him away to the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet. A crushing sentence like that should have been the definitive end of his story. Instead, it became the explosive beginning of the fugitive years. After about a year in custody, Gillis was pulled from Joliet to face yet another bank robbery charge in Wheaton. On February 17, 1932, while being returned to Joliet, he slipped his captors. He escaped from the prison guards. He didn't need to defeat imposing prison walls. He simply exploited transit. That's a fundamental lesson every experienced criminal understood. A prison has iron gates, deadlocks, watchtowers, and rigid routines. But a prisoner in transit? There are fewer barriers and endless uncertainty. Gillis found the weak point in the armor, and he slipped right through it. Now, he couldn't live as Lester Gillis anymore. He needed aliases. He needed temporary rooms, stolen vehicles, and friends who knew better than to ask questions. He fled through Reno, Nevada, pushing westward until he hit Sausalito, California. That is where he met John Paul Chase. John Paul Chase was built entirely different from Nelson. Chase had worked brutal ranch jobs near San Rafael. He'd ground away in railway shops, first as a lowly office boy, and later as a machinist's apprentice. He'd attended school only through the 5th grade, but he understood the things that mattered out west: engines, roots, hard work, and silence. By 1930, Chase was deeply entangled in a liquor smuggling operation connected to powerful underworld figures. When Nelson reached California, Chase brought him in. Nelson was hired as an armed guard on the heavy trucks used to haul the illegal liquor. The formula was flawlessly simple. A driver moved the shipment. The underground criminal network provided the secret route and destination. Nelson provided the absolute threat. The money poured in from a product the public demanded, but the law prohibited. The danger constantly shadowed them from rival crews, local police, hijackers, and sudden betrayal. Chase quickly became Nelson's closest associate. He sometimes even introduced Nelson as his half-brother. That cover story did far more than just hide an identity. It created the illusion of blood loyalty in a treacherous world where almost everyone would gladly betray you for $1. Borrowed family was a survival tool. Nelson remained out in California with his wife, Helen Gillis, until May 1933. Then, he moved to Long Beach, Indiana, stepping into the shadows of a criminal network around a man named Homer Van Eater. Van Eater would later become one of the better-known members of the Dillinger gang. At this exact point, it's critical to tear the real timeline away from the movie mythology. John Dillinger's crew was already generating blaring national headlines. On June 10, 1933, Dillinger robbed a bank in New Carlisle, Ohio, taking $10,600. Months later, on October 23rd, the Dillinger gang hit the Central National Bank in Greencastle, Indiana, walking away with a staggering $75,000. Babyface Nelson was absolutely not a part of those 1933 Dillinger operations. Dillinger was building his legendary name across the Midwest. Nelson was still navigating the country through his own dark network, using his own rotating aliases, and deepening his lethal bond with John Paul Chase. Their stories would inevitably collide, but the fact that they weren't initially the same crew is exactly what made their eventual partnership so dangerous. In December 1933, Nelson reached out to Chase again. They spent much of the following year inseparable. Their lives devolved into a chaotic chain of temporary stops: Minneapolis, Breton, Reno, Chicago, California. They traveled constantly because staying still meant getting caught. During that dark, restless period, a man was shot and killed in Minneapolis. The shooters were reportedly fleeing in a vehicle bearing California license plates that were later traced directly back to a car owned by Nelson. After a trip to Breton, Nelson and Chase circled back to Reno. Chase would later admit that Nelson brutally killed a man during an altercation there. The victim wasn't just a bystander. He was a material witness in a massive United States mail fraud case. The exact details of every single killing during that chaotic fugitive period aren't equally documented, but the larger, terrifying fact remains crystal clear. By the time Babyface Nelson finally entered the gravitational pull of John Dillinger's orbit, he wasn't merely a bank thief with a gun. He was a highly violent fugitive, carrying a rapidly growing body count and riding shotgun with a fully trusted criminal partner. In April 1934, Nelson, Helen Gillis, and Chase went to Chicago. It was there that Nelson officially joined the Dillinger gang. Chase remained behind in Chicago, while Nelson and Helen traveled with the Dillinger group up to the Little Bohemia Lodge in northern Wisconsin. For Nelson, this was the major leagues. John Dillinger had become a national obsession. He'd escaped from jail. He'd robbed banks in broad daylight. He'd transformed into the ultimate symbol of the Depression-era outlaw. Some people looked at Dillinger and saw a folk hero. Law enforcement, however, saw something far more practical. A highly mobile criminal crew that could cross state lines, rob banks, steal cars, and completely disappear before local police departments could even coordinate a response. The gang's method was built entirely around speed. They targeted banks where they believed the cash vault could be reached quickly. They used stolen vehicles because the first car could simply be abandoned after the robbery. They carried serious, heavy weapons to overwhelmingly silence local resistance. They planned for minutes, not hours. The opportunity they exploited was the uneven strength of local law enforcement. Their inside advantage was accumulated experience, seasoned criminals who intimately knew vehicles, escape routes, weapons, timing, and exactly where to find safe houses. The execution was brutally simple. Enter fast, control the room, take the cash, leave before the town even understood what had happened. The money was immediate. The consequences were not. Every major score increased their publicity. Every blaring headline brought heavier law enforcement pressure. Every stolen car became a possible lead, and every gunfight made the crew infinitely easier to identify. At Little Bohemia, the illusion of safety collapsed. The lodge was supposed to be a flawless hideout. It offered thick woods, quiet roads, and crucial distance from Chicago, a place where the exhausted gang could finally rest. But every hideout has one permanent, fatal weakness. Other people know you're there. On April 22, 1934, agents of the Division of Investigation learned the gang's location and moved quietly toward the lodge. Their plan was flawless on paper: surround the property before the sleeping fugitives could react. Then, the dog started barking. That single sound changed the night. The gangsters instantly understood that the trap was closing, and they escaped out into the cold darkness. The federal operation went disastrously badly. In the confusion, agents accidentally shot and killed a tavern customer and wounded 2 other innocent civilians. Dillinger slipped away into the shadows. Nelson, however, didn't take the cleanest route out. He ran to a nearby home, violently forced his way inside, and took 2 people hostage. Shortly afterward, Special Agents J.C. Newman and W. Carter, BAWM, arrived at the scene with a local constable. Nelson rushed their car and ordered the occupants out, but before they could even fully comply, he opened fire. BAWM was killed. Newman and the constable were wounded. That was the exact moment Lester Gillis stopped being primarily a bank robber in the public imagination. He'd killed a federal agent. The Division of Investigation had lost one of its own. From that night forward, the pressure on him became intensely personal, highly organized, and absolutely relentless. The movie Public Enemies heavily captures Nelson's extreme volatility, and that portrayal has a strong historical basis. But volatility in a professional criminal crew isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a massive liability. Bank robbers survive through precise timing, strict planning, and clean escapes. Nelson had a deadly habit of turning simple encounters into raging firefights. Every unnecessary shot he fired created a new victim, a new witness, and a completely new reason for the full weight of federal law enforcement to hunt him down. Within a short time, Chase rejoined Nelson. Helen Gillis, who'd been released on parole, met them about a month later. They laid low near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, for several days. On June 23, 1934, Attorney General Homer S. Cummings offered a reward relating to Nelson's capture or information leading to his arrest. That exact same day, the Justice Department put a heavy price on the head of the gang, $10,000 for Dillinger's arrest and $5,000 for information leading to it. The government was making a very clear public statement. These men were no longer local criminals, they were national targets. 1 week later, on June 30th, 1934, Nelson, John Dillinger, and Homer Van Meter struck the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. The gang walked away with about $30,000. A police officer was shot and killed in the chaos. The robbery followed the classic pattern. The opportunity was a bank with accessible cash and a town that couldn't instantly block every road out. The gang's inside advantage was pure experience. They knew how to perfectly utilize stolen cars, heavy weapons, intimidation, and speed. The execution depended on overwhelmingly controlling the bank before anyone could organize resistance. But the problem was that the gang had become far too famous. By the summer of 1934, a robbery connected to Dillinger or Nelson was no longer just a local crime. It was breaking national news. Police departments diligently watched the roads. Newspapers splashed their photographs across the front pages. The federal government was rapidly gaining more authority. The old system that these criminals had so easily exploited was changing all around them. After South Bend, the gang fled back to Chicago. Later, 2 police officers unwittingly approached a gang meeting place on Wolf Road outside the city. Nelson immediately opened fire. Both officers were shot. That incident revealed the stark difference between Nelson and the mythology built around him. He wasn't merely responding to a dramatic, unavoidable moment. He was creating more enemies at the exact time when he desperately needed fewer. Then came the turning point. On July 22, 1934, John Dillinger was shot and killed by Division of Investigation agents outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. He was 31 years old. For the American public, Dillinger's bloody death felt like the definitive end of the story. It wasn't. For Nelson, it meant the country's most famous outlaw was gone. The largest distraction had disappeared. Now, the full weight of national attention violently shifted toward the smaller man with the young face and the growing body count. Nelson, Helen Gillis, Chase, and 2 associates fled Chicago for California. That summer, Nelson and Chase repeatedly traveled between Chicago and California. They were trying to stay unpredictable, but constant movement creates its own unique vulnerability. On one occasion, they were actually stopped for speeding in a small town. They paid a $5 fine at the local police station and were promptly released. Their car contained machine guns, rifles, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. It was never searched. $5. That was the price of one of America's most wanted fugitives slipping cleanly through a local police encounter. It doesn't prove Nelson was a mastermind. It proves the law enforcement system still had massive, exploitable gaps. Federal agencies, local departments, sheriffs, and state authorities simply didn't share information with modern speed. A fugitive could easily cross a state line before a photograph, a fingerprint, or a bulletin caught up to them. But the government was desperately trying to close that gap. On May 18, 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt signed legislation giving the federal government unprecedented power to fight crime. On June 18th, Division of Investigation agents received full arrest powers and official permission to carry firearms without special authorization. On July 1st, 1935 months after Nelson's eventual death, the Division of Investigation would officially become the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nelson lived at the very end of the old era. He'd made his bloody name in the dark spaces between city police, county sheriffs, state borders, and weak communication. By late 1934, those spaces were rapidly shrinking. In late August, Nelson and the group returned to Chicago. Within a month, the gang scattered. Nelson went to Nevada, and Chase traveled to New York City. They reunited near Minden, Nevada, on October 10, 1934. Then, they turned back towards Chicago. On November 26th, Nelson and Chase stole a car in Chicago and drove toward Wisconsin. The next day, Inspector Samuel P. Coe received word that Nelson had been seen driving the stolen vehicle near Binghamton, Illinois. 2 federal agents spotted the car. Nelson, refusing to run, turned around and came up right behind them. Chase fired 5 rounds from an automatic rifle into the agent's vehicle. One agent returned fire. A single bullet hit the radiator of Nelson's car, partially disabling it. That mechanical failure changed absolutely everything. The stolen car was their ultimate protection. It gave them speed, it gave them distance, and it gave them the chance to choose the next road. A damaged radiator meant their escape was now running on borrowed time. Inspector Cowie and Special Agent Herman Edward Hallis approached in another automobile and began pursuing Nelson and Chase. Near the entrance to Northside Park in Bington, Nelson violently veered off the Northwest Highway and slammed on the brakes. Then, the final fight began. Before Cowie and Hallis could even fully get out of their car, Nelson and Chase opened fire with automatic weapons. The battle lasted only 4 or 5 minutes. Hallis was killed. Cowie was mortally wounded. He'd die early the next morning. Nelson, too, was critically wounded. This wasn't a clean, cinematic ending. No crowd watched. No newspaper photographer caught the moment. It was just road dust, shattered glass, damaged vehicles, automatic weapons, wounded men, and a desperate, bleeding escape. Chase helped Nelson into Cowie's government vehicle. They hurriedly moved guns and other items from Nelson's dying car into the agent's car. Helen Gillis, who'd been lying flat in a field during the raging battle, scrambled into the vehicle as Chase drove away. Nelson died at about 8 o'clock that evening. The next day, following an anonymous telephone call, federal agents found his body dumped near a cemetery in Nye Olds Center, Illinois, a town now known as Skohaki. Babyface Nelson was 25 years old. The aftermath was completely stripped of glamour. Helen Gillis was arrested on November 29, 1934, for violating her parole. She received 1 year and 1 day at the Women's Federal Reformatory in Milan, Michigan. Chase returned to Chicago on November 30th. He answered a want ad seeking men to drive automobiles out to Seattle. To get the job, he needed a chauffeur's license, which meant he had to be photographed at a local police station. That single photograph became his undoing, because Chase hadn't previously been the kind of criminal whose face appeared widely on wanted circulars. Federal agents traced his former employers and associates all the way back to California. On December 27, 1934, Chase tried to borrow money from workers at the fish hatcheries near Mount Shasta, where he'd once worked. The workers immediately alerted authorities. Chief of Police Alberts arrested him. Chase was brought back to Chicago on December 31st. His trial began on March 18, 1935. 1 week later, a jury found him guilty of murdering Inspector Samuel P. ADWA. He was sent to the inescapable walls of Alcatraz on March 31st, 1935. He was later transferred to Leavenworth. He was finally paroled on October 31st, 1966, and he died of cancer in Palo Alto, California, on October 5th, 1973. That is the real legacy of Babyface Nelson. Not a sprawling criminal empire, not a hidden buried fortune, not a romantic outlaw ending. It was a dead federal agent at Little Bohemia, 2 more federal agents shot to pieces at Bington, a widow sent to a federal prison, a loyal partner who spent decades locked behind bars, and a bloody body left near a cemetery after one last escape finally failed. The movie Public Enemies gets several essential details right. Babyface Nelson was real. He ran with John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter. He was small, boyish-looking, and internationally known for sudden, explosive violence. The real Little Bohemia raid did collapse into chaos after the gang was alerted. Nelson did kill Special Agent W. Carter BAWM, and he did die after a savage gunfight near Bington in November 1934. But the film compresses a much longer, much more complicated reality. Nelson wasn't simply Dillinger's unstable side character. He'd escaped custody years earlier, developed his own highly successful criminal partnership with John Paul Chase, and entered the Dillinger orbit only after building a violent, terrifying record entirely of his own. The Bington finale was also far more chaotic than a simple, honorable final showdown. Chase fired on federal agents during the pursuit. Nelson's car was fatally damaged. Hollis died at the scene. Cowie died the following morning. Nelson was carried away and bled out later that evening. The largest distortion isn't a single Hollywood scene. It's the sheer scale of Nelson's independence. Hollywood presents him inside Dillinger's story. The documented historical record shows that Babyface Nelson became a massive national threat in his own right. Power built on fear always creates the exact same ending. Eventually, everybody close enough to help you is also just trying to survive you. Subscribe for more real stories from the criminal underworld, and tell me which figure should be covered next, the movie myth or the documented reality.